The U.S. economy rebounded in the second fiscal quarter of the year, growing at a better than expected rate despite President Trump's tariffs. The country's GDP grew at a 3% pace from April to June, reversing a 0.5 decline from the previous quarter. Consumer spending also rose. But the growth comes despite a sharp decline in imports, which dropped by 30.3%. The Wall Street Journal editorial board called it the weirdest GDP report ever, while President Trump touted the growth as a success.
We smashed all expectations. They thought it would be maybe a little bit less than 2, and it was 3, a little bit more than 3. At the same time, inflation continues to fall faster than expectations, and for the 5th consecutive month, core inflation was lower than predicted substantially. This is truly the dawn of the golden age of America. That's what we're in. We want to keep it that way.
The Federal Reserve, meanwhile, is leaving interest rates unchanged following its two-day policy meeting. Fed Chair Jerome Powell announced yesterday rates will remain steady amid persistent inflation and a tight job market. It's the 5th time this year the Fed has left short-term interest rates the same, despite President Trump's consistent calls for cuts. What's different this time, though, is 2 Fed governors did split with Powell. They voted for rates to be lowered. This is the first dual dissent in more than 30 years. Joining us now, congressional reporter for Semafor, Eleanor Mueller. So, Eleanor, let's start there, because you've been talking to members on Capitol Hill who actually don't share Trump's desire for rates to be lowered. He's been vocal about that, but now they're being vocal in the opposite way. What does this tell you?
It's fascinating. I mean, this is Trump's party. You know, a lot of them are not going to say outwardly that Trump is wrong in pressuring Powell to specifically cut rates as part of these FOMC meetings. But what they will say is that their issues with Powell center on other issues. So they'll say, oh, I think he really mismanaged the renovation of the Federal Reserve's headquarters. They'll say, oh, I think that he doesn't do a great job supervising banks. And that's what we wrote about yesterday, was all of these members who we went to kind of explain, hey, how do you reconcile the fact that, 1, the economy is really strong under Trump, and 2, we need to cut interest rates? And they basically were like, we're not advocating that. You know, we're advocating less spending to bring down long-term rates. We're advocating changes to how the Federal Reserve pays interest on banks' extra cash as a way to maybe motivate them to lend more. And they're not actually backing that specific call for Powell to cut rates. I think in an acknowledgement of just how much of an impingement on the Federal Reserve's monetary policy independence that is.
Yeah, it's that word independence, I think, that has been so central to this debate over the way that the White House is trying to pressure the Fed, doing so much as to go tour those renovations that were seen in some circles as an early excuse if the president wanted to have some kind of reason to try to fire Powell. Again, that would have been legally dubious, but it seemed like they were trying to at least lay the foundation for that. And on Capitol Hill, it's fascinating to see that these Republicans are at least trying to preserve that independence and maybe not apply the pressure that the president is applying.
They're trying to pivot. I mean, Cynthia Lummis has been one of the earliest supporters of Trump's calls for Powell to resign. You know, she's doing things like tweeting about Powell being, you know, quote unquote, woke, tweeting, you know, AI generated images of Powell in a pool, relaxing instead of doing his job. And even she was like, I think the bigger problem is long-term rates, which the Fed, you know, sets only indirectly at these meetings. It's mostly expectations around inflation and debt and things like that. And so it's fascinating to watch the divergence. That is not to say that there are not those Republicans who are willing to walk closer to that line. I think after we wrote that story, senators in their Republican lunch yesterday presented to their colleagues on why, in fact, you know, Powell should lower interest rates. Senator Bernie Moreno told me that he talked a lot about how, you know, long-term rates actually are affected by short-term rates. He talked about the Fed renovation. You know, he said colleagues presented on other issues with Powell's mismanagement of the Fed, including its operational losses. And so there is a small group of really loyal Trump allies that I think is pushing to back him in this cut for lower interest rates. But a lot of other members, even though they will say that they think Powell's doing a bad job, he should step down, they're not willing to go so far as to say, let's tell you how to do your monetary policy.
Well, they just got to make it until May. That's when Powell's term expires. The other piece of this that's interesting is that as they are about to head out of town, at least in theory, they've faced pressure to stay for their August recess. But they are also debating right now a ban on lawmakers' ability to trade stocks. This is an argument or a bill or a legislative push that comes up every few years. I've covered multiple iterations of that. But what is the conversation in the Senate right now? Take us inside that.
Well, if you are an avid C-SPAN watcher, as I know you are, Allie, you got the privilege of watching Josh Hawley battle it out with the other Republican senators on his Senate committee yesterday as they were trying to advance the bill. He's trying to do something a little bit different than the House is, right? We've been in touch with the House as they've been trying to merge all of their respective proposals, banning stock trading by lawmakers specifically. Hawley's proposal actually would ban stock trading by the president and the vice president. And his argument is, well, Trump and Vance would be exempt because the requirements on divesting your stock specifically would not go into effect until after they left office. Mm-hmm. That doesn't seem to be good enough for Trump. You know, we saw him tweet yesterday coming after Hawley, calling him a pawn who was controlled by Democrats, you know, saying that he was conducting sabotage against the White House. And I caught up with Hawley shortly after. He said, you know, I want this thing passed. I'm happy to make some changes if that's what Trump wants. I spoke with, again, Bernie Moreno, who said, I'm looking to get re-engaged. He was a co-sponsor. He voted against this bill. And so it seems like we're headed in a direction where this maybe could move if they rein it in. But the reception from leadership has been cool, to say the least. So there's a rocky path here.
Yeah, it's a rocky path, but it is one that we've seen in bipartisan fashion over the course of the last few Congresses. It would be notable if they were able to ban stock trading for lawmakers. And there have been instances where people have questioned, did lawmakers have information that then prompted them to make various stock moves? It is fascinating. It also portends big issues for Republicans in the future, but we'll get there when we get there. For now, Eleanor Mueller, thank you, as always.